After our divorce, my ex-husband clung to this bizarre belief that I still loved him, which was both frustrating and far from the truth. What's more, he was convinced that the sole reason for our split was his mother, Jessie, as if resolving issues with her would magically fix everything. That thought alone was enough to infuriate me. I married Ken, who was 8 years older than me, when I was in my early 20s. Ken, being older, had a domineering attitude and a sharp tongue, but back then, I was young and naively thought, "He's so manly and wonderful." I accepted everything about him without question. When he complained about my cooking or how I cleaned, and said, "I'm telling you this for your own good," I believed him, thinking, "That's wonderful." And when he told me to walk 3 steps behind him on dates, I obediently agreed. My friends expressed disgust at this and warned me it wasn't right, but I was so deeply in love with Ken, having pursued him first, that their concerns fell on deaf ears. Looking back, I deeply regret how I treated those who tried to advise me, even cutting ties with them and cutting off all communication. My parents weren't fond of Ken either and opposed our marriage until the very end. But in my pathologically optimistic state, I thought, if I get pregnant, they'll have to accept it. This led to a regrettable decision to force my parents to accept the marriage by getting pregnant with my eldest daughter. This regrettable incident is still mentioned by my mom as a back then story. Now, a mother of 3 daughters, I painfully realize how reckless I was, and worry about my children potentially making the same mistakes. So we got married in a shotgun wedding, and I gave birth. Ken didn't become more involved in household chores or childcare. He remained detached, even as I struggled with new motherhood. I repeatedly asked for his help with childcare, but he always had excuses like, "I have work," or "I've never raised a child, so I don't know how." Eventually, I resigned myself to doing it alone. Thankfully, my mom came to help, which was a saving grace. Without her, I shudder to think what would have happened. As for my relationship with my in-laws, it wasn't great. Jessie, my mother-in-law, who prided herself on having 3 sons, exclaimed upon the birth of my first daughter, "You should have had a boy like me." As if the gender of the baby mattered, when all I wanted was for them to be born healthy. Even after that, Jessie would come to our house unannounced, not to help like a mom would, but to lecture me. She'd say things like, "You need to have a male heir," or "Having girls is pointless since they'll just marry and leave." Her advice wasn't helpful, just a series of meaningless admonitions. She would come, make herself feel better by lecturing, and then leave. Her snide remarks didn't stop even as my eldest daughter grew. If I mentioned sending her to daycare, Jessie would say, "It's sad that a mother isn't with her child." Or if my daughter was shy around strangers, "It's because you work and don't give her enough love." Before getting married, I thought I had to cherish Ken's mom because I loved him, but becoming a mom myself made me stronger. Ken wouldn't budge, no matter how much I complained, so I started to speak up directly to Jessie. As expected, this led to frequent mother-in-law and daughter-in-law conflicts. Ken finally started to intervene, albeit only 1 in 3 times. Initially, Ken was of no use, always defending his mom. But when Jessie mistook a gift I chose for Mother's Day as Ken's choice and complained about it for an hour, or when she blamed me for a stomachache after eating sweets Ken bought, saying it was because of the bad sweets I gave her, he began to see my point. Finally, Ken took my side completely and apologized for the first time since our marriage, admitting his mom was wrong. We had serious discussions about sharing household chores and childcare, my pent-up feelings, and dealing with Jessie. Gradually, Ken began to participate more in housework and childcare. He started to shield me from Jessie's constant jabs. He wasn't perfect, but he had changed a lot compared to before. I still resent him for leaving me alone with a newborn, though. I still resent having to take care of a newborn all by myself, which was incredibly tough. Even then, there were times when I was mocked, but by that point, I had grown a thicker skin and could just brush it off with a, yeah, or assertively telling someone when I really didn't like something. When our eldest daughter was 4, I found out I was pregnant with our second child. This time, Ken, who hadn't done much during my first pregnancy, started to take initiative. When I was laid up with morning sickness, he would prepare simple dishes for our daughter or hang the laundry, albeit a bit wrinkled. I was very grateful for his help, but Jessie couldn't stand being silent about it. Somehow, she heard that Ken was doing chores and stormed into our house uninvited, looking furious. "What are you doing making your husband do housework? Morning sickness is nothing serious. When I was pregnant, I did all the housework, even when I was bleeding. If it's that hard, you should just quit your job and take care of the house. This is the problem with working women, always so weak and whiny." After saying her piece, she left huffing and puffing. I told Ken about this, and he strongly confronted Jessie. It was astonishing how she could brag about doing household chores in such a dangerous state during her pregnancy. Ken's reprimand seemed to work as she stopped barging in. However, during my second pregnancy, I developed complications and had to be hospitalized. I had only told my parents, not my in-laws, but somehow Jessie found out. Despite being told that only my husband could visit, she barged into the hospital, causing a scene in the waiting room, shouting, "I'll set my son's wife straight." Afterwards, Jessie was lectured and escorted out by the doctors and nurses. I apologized profusely to them, feeling embarrassed and sorry. The nurses said it was a common occurrence, which was a sad realization in itself. Afterwards, thanks to the help of the nurses and Ken's support, I safely gave birth to our second daughter. She inherited my features, hooded eyelids, and natural curly hair, unlike our first daughter, who has Ken's distinct double eyelids. But she was just as precious to me as our first, the most beautiful child in the world. However, Jessie found something to criticize again. When we went to show the baby to Ken's parents after getting discharged, Jessie looked at our second daughter and said, "She has such an unlucky look on her face. It's depressing to watch. This must be because you worked during pregnancy. And another girl? You really are useless. In the old days, girls were considered so worthless they were given away." I was so fed up with her that we left immediately. I unloaded all my pent-up frustrations and sadness from her insult to our second daughter on Ken, crying my heart out, and warned him, "If you make me deal with that woman again, it's divorce." Honestly, I wouldn't have minded divorcing at that point, considering everything. But Ken promised to keep us away from her, so I decided to trust him and leave the rest to him. True to his promise, my daughters and I never met Jessie again, and Ken only occasionally visited her. I heard Jessie was angry, but I didn't care. It was all her fault after all. So when I got pregnant with our third child, I didn't tell her, and even after the birth, I never let her meet the baby. Our third child was also a girl, which made me even less inclined to let her meet Jessie. I knew she would just make another snide comment like, "Another girl, huh?" For decades, my daughters and I lived without any contact with Jessie, enjoying stress-free Christmases and Thanksgivings, until one incident shattered our peaceful family life and led to our separation. The incident was Jessie injuring her leg and becoming unable to move around as she used to. Ken told me about it after returning from his parents' house, and my response was just, "Oh, really?" But then, in the next moment, Ken said something absurd. "I want to invite Mom to our house." He had even already told her she could come. That's what real aversion feels like. I couldn't understand why he would make such a decision. First of all, Ken's unmarried younger brother lives with Jessie at the in-laws' house, so there's no need to bring her to our house for care. When I pointed this out, Ken suddenly declared, "I'm the eldest son, so I should take care of her," despite never using the eldest son argument before. Apparently, Jessie did most of the housework, leaving the younger brother incapable of managing anything. I suggested, why not share the caregiving responsibilities with your brother at your parents' house? Ken responded, "But I'm the eldest son, and I've never really shown my gratitude to Mom. This is my last chance to show my appreciation. We don't know how many years she has left." By the way, Jessie is robust other than her leg injury, with no issues in her health checkups. While it's fine for him to show gratitude to his parents however he wants, I told him, "I have work, so I won't get involved, and I won't allow her in our house." Ken retorted, But your salary from your clerical job isn't that significant, right? I've indulged your whims until now by not visiting my parents' house. But now you can't help with an emergency situation? Really? Mom was right. Working women are inflexible and charmless. You were the one who confessed to me, and now you can't even support me a little? He sighed in exasperation. Then, to my shock, he produced a complete divorce application and said, "Think about this," and left without waiting for my reply. I couldn't stop crying as I looked at the filled-out divorce application. I couldn't help but wonder why I ever married such a terrible man. I was overwhelmed with tears of regret. Was Ken really perceiving my refusal to visit his parents' house due to Jesse's harassment as just my whim? Had he forgotten how his own children were constantly belittled by her? The reason I worked was because Ken's salary alone wasn't enough to support us. Yet he saw my job as another one of my whims. That's ridiculous. Fortunately, our children were already independent, so there were no child support expenses. My salary wasn't high, but it was enough for me to live on my own. And with a full-time job, I had a decent bonus, so there were no financial worries. Deciding this, I packed my belongings, informed my children of the divorce, and they unanimously supported my decision, saying I had endured enough. I then moved to a business hotel and filed the divorce papers the next day. When I explained the situation to my parents, they just shook their heads, saying they had opposed the marriage for this reason. After filing, I contacted Ken to inform him that I had submitted the divorce application. He called me immediately, angrily asking, "Why did you file it?" I responded, "You told me to think about it, right? So I thought about it and decided to file. Is there a problem?" He replied, "I didn't mean it like that, and I didn't think you would actually file it." What? Did you think showing me the divorce papers would make me comply? Wow, I didn't know you could be so deceitful. The person I fell in love with wasn't like that. Besides, anyone who uses threats and divorce papers to get their way would instantly kill any love I had. I can't trust or live with someone so cowardly. When he asked, "Don't you still love me anymore?" I replied, "I did. But at that moment, I started to hate you. There's no reason to love someone who threatens me with divorce papers." I said this with a surprisingly cold voice and then hung up the phone and turned it off. After turning my phone back on, I saw many missed calls from Ken, but I had nothing left to say to him, so I didn't call back. Then Ken came to my parents' house, pleading at the front door for me to come back and deeply apologizing. Of course, my answer was no. I reiterated the reasons I had given over the phone. As he continued to complain and express dissatisfaction, I said, "You say you want me to come back, but you just want a servant to take care of Jessie, right? It seems like you've already told your siblings you'd take her in, and now no one is willing to help you. Am I wrong? Besides, you said it yourself. You want to show gratitude to your parents. Without me, you can do that to your heart's content. Isn't that great?" He didn't argue, so probably I was right. Still, he wouldn't leave, so I threatened to call the police, and that made him leave, looking disappointed and defeated. Afterwards, I messaged him saying, "If you come again, I won't hesitate to call the police." He didn't respond. There was no further contact from him, and I continued my life as usual, but one day, I received a call from Annie, the wife of Ken's second brother, the third son, with whom I had had little interaction. I hadn't seen or contacted her since I stopped going to the in-laws' house. Annie, too, had been harassed by Jesse. Apparently, Jesse had some pretty harsh things to say to Annie, who couldn't have children, which led to Annie and her husband, Ken's brother, moving far away and effectively cutting ties with the in-laws. The reason Annie contacted me was, of course, related to the in-laws. She knew about our divorce because Ken had told his brother, and Annie shared with me what had happened to Ken afterwards. As expected, Ken had planned to leave all of Jesse's care to me, but my divorce had thrown his plans into disarray. In a panic, Ken called a family meeting with his brothers. However, since he had already boasted about taking in Jesse as the eldest son, There was conflict when the story changed, leading to a fight among the brothers. The second son insisted he couldn't help because he didn't know housework and was busy with work. The third son, whose wife had a history of being harassed, refused to have anything to do with Jesse. With his brothers adamantly refusing to cooperate and no resolution in sight, Ken stubbornly declared, "Then I'll take care of her, you ungrateful people," and took Jesse in. He accused them of lacking gratitude towards their parents, but I think Ken, who first said he would take her and then backed out, is the one who failed to fulfill his responsibility to his parents. Taking care of her while working must be tough. Everyone at work said the same. Also, during the discussion, my husband mentioned that Ken still believed you must love him, blaming Jesse for driving you apart. So there might be a chance that he will try to contact you again. I don't want to bring up Ken's matters, but I thought I should warn you. Hearing this gave me chills. After everything that had happened, how could he still believe I had any love left for him? It seems from what I heard that Ken doesn't think the divorce was his fault. I thanked Annie and ended the call, staying alert for a while, but there was no contact from Ken. Years passed without any incident, and I thought my worries had been unnecessary. But Annie's warning eventually became a reality. Nearly 10 years after the divorce, I received a call from Ken. Expecting nothing good, I answered, but it was just small talk at first. Growing impatient with the pointless conversation, I told him I'd hang up if he had nothing important to say. He then hurriedly began talking about his situation. Ken's life had been as Annie suspected. Taking care of Jesse while working was extremely difficult. He often had to miss work for caregiving duties, and Jessie, frustrated with her inability to move as she wished, started taking it out on Ken. Initially, it was just venting, but her paranoia escalated, accusing Ken of stealing her wallet and screaming at him as a thief. Realizing something was seriously wrong, Ken took a reluctant Jessie to the hospital, where she was diagnosed with dementia. Despite being prescribed medication, she didn't calm down. She would scream loudly enough for the neighborhood to hear, claiming that strangers were entering the house and attacking her. With her physical strength still intact, she even started wandering outside, pushing her walker. Ken, finally reaching his limit, decided to place Jessie in a facility and humbly asked his brothers to share the costs. Recently, they managed to find a place for her. After hearing everything, my immediate response was, "So what?" I was even surprised by my own unconscious reaction. Ken seemed even more shocked. I told him, "If someone else told me this, I might say, that's tough, but honestly, I couldn't care less about you guys. Why are you even telling me this? So what if she's in a facility? It's none of my business." When he asked why I was being so cold, I replied, "What? You wanted sympathy or a there from your ex-wife? You're a man over 60 seeking comfort from an ex-wife. That's creepy. We were married once, but now we're strangers. I'll say it again. I don't love you or anything like that. I'm indifferent. I'm happy post-divorce, so stop disturbing my life." Then I hung up and blocked Ken's contact details, something I should have done long ago. I thought that would make it clear to Ken, but I was naive. Later, a letter from Ken arrived at my parents' house. The letter, written over 4 pages, was more like a creepy note than a love letter. It said, "I'm sorry for being a coward who didn't protect you from the devil that was Mom. She tore us apart, but now that devil is gone. There's nothing to stop us. I know it's been a long detour, but if any of your feelings remain, I'm ready to accept your love. Come back with nothing but yourself." Reading it with my mom, we both felt disgusted. Apparently, Ken also reached out to our daughters, asking for their help to reconcile, but all of them refused, and my dad even scolded him, saying he was the problem. Enraged, Ken apparently accused our daughters of being ungrateful for his financial support for their education. But when our eldest asked him if he really thought I'd want to reconcile with someone who spoke so arrogantly, he lost his earlier bluster and fell silent. Though my daughters are still living independently, and it's unlikely Ken would go to them, I still warned them to be cautious and shared the content of the letter. There was a time when I heard that men often think every woman they date is interested in them, but I shrugged it off as unlikely. Now, I can't believe it was actually true. After more than a decade since our separation, Ken sending such a letter proves he still doesn't think he's at fault. But of course, there's no chance of repairing our relationship. Now that he's been rejected by his own daughters, he can spend his lonely old age alone.